Welcome to this side event on the human rights crisis facing Afghanistan and possible responses to it by the Human Rights Council. My name is Sam Zarifi. I'm the Secretary General of the International Commission of Jurists, and I'm very pleased to be hosting this event with our colleagues from the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch. While we're waiting for some more people to come in, just some housekeeping. As you may have noted, the presentations will be recorded, not the question and answer and comments, if there are any comments from the floor. So just their presentations themselves will be recorded for this session. This is in a webinar format, so for registered attendees, there are two ways that you can make your questions known. There is a Q&A button icon that you can see at the bottom of your screen. You can put your questions there, and I think all of the panelists can see, and we will try to address them. Or you can put your comments in the chat section. And if we do have time at the end, and if there are statements, especially from state representatives, please identify yourself in the chat and ask for the floor, and we will see if we can put you into the order of speaking. We have gathered this discussion here today, obviously, given the rapidly changing situation in Afghanistan since the end of August and the Taliban's takeover of much of the country. There's already been a special session of the Human Rights Council dedicated to this issue, in which the Human Rights Council has identified its concern and had asked for a robust and transparent investigation of this issue as soon as possible. This side event is going to present information, expertise about the situation since that special session, pointing out that in fact the human rights situation has gotten worse, and to ask for immediate response by the Human Rights Council commensurate with the gravity of the crisis. And that means absolutely creating a robust mechanism with the resources and expertise to monitor and report on the situation immediately, in order to complement the work that UNAMA has been doing and is going to continue to do. In this regard, we hope to build on the resolution of the special session. We will make the case, as you will hear, that it's crucial that we begin the job of monitoring right now, in part because events on the ground are moving very quickly, and we have seen a deterioration of human rights across the spectrum: civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. And it's crucial, as the Human Rights Council has pointed out on multiple occasions, for the Council to put in effect mechanisms that would help prevent human rights catastrophes instead of reporting on them post-mortem, literally, as the case will be. I'm very happy that we will be able to hear from people with the most up-to-date information about what is happening in Afghanistan, as well as my colleagues who have had a great deal of expertise in terms of working in the human rights mechanisms and framework, and suggesting what we can do to address this grave situation. I want to point out that, as you may have seen, we had hoped that our colleague Wajma Frug would be able to join us to speak today. Unfortunately, Wajma has withdrawn, so we will not have time. Unfortunately, we won't be able to hear from her. So finally, I'm going to start. The format today will be that we will hear an informational factual update from Ms. Shahrzad Akbar, the head of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, which is not an NGO, but rather a constitutionally mandated body in Afghanistan. I will then open for some comments from the floor, and we will then switch to the other panelists who will be able to share their expertise regarding the situation. I'm very pleased to have with us Mr. Kenneth Roth, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, Professor Fanula Lane, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism, Ms. Agnes Callamore, the Secretary General of Amnesty International. So with that, let me hand over to Ms. Shahrzad Akbar for an update on what the most recent information is from Afghanistan. Ms. Akbar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sam. I'm truly honored to be speaking to all of you and to be part of this panel. I will first give you an update on what we are hearing about the situation on the ground, the human rights situation on the ground, since the last Human Rights Council session in August. So what we have been hearing in early September and so far. Targeted killings, unfortunately, continue in Afghanistan. We saw a spike in targeted killings with the signing of US Taliban agreements. We see a continuation of targeted killings despite Taliban's almost full control of the country. And this recent series of targeted killings mostly target former national security forces. But we don't hear any follow-up in terms of arrests of those involved in targeted killings or any form of investigations. These target killings that are being reported from different parts of the country, for instance, we have reports from Nangarhar, we have reports from Ghor, we have reports, some reports from Herat. In all these cases, although mostly from what we see, they are mostly former security forces, sometimes ordinary citizens whose family members may have been members of security forces. They are creating an environment of fear for everyone, including, of course, for human rights defenders, women's rights activists, and journalists that are still in the country, most of them in hiding, most of them changing locations regularly, and especially because there doesn't seem to be an investigation or a follow-up or any form of accountability for these targeted killings or even any claims of responsibility. This intensifies the fears and continues to feed the culture of impunity and an environment of fear. There are also reports yet to be fully verified, but we have reports of extrajudicial killing of detainees. Even the conditions of the arrest are not often clear for how these, on the basis of what laws these people have been detained. And then, some of them, at least one case in Kunar, where the detainee was then killed in detention. There is, of course, the very worrying reinstitution of inhuman punishments and degrading of human dignity. As recent as 25th September, we heard about the hanging of bodies in Herat of alleged abductors who have been allegedly killed in exchange of fire with Taliban soldiers. And of course, this also again has led to a lot of anxiety and fear, but also a fear about reinstitution of these forms of punishments, including, for instance, stoning that was previously conducted under the Taliban. Of course, a Taliban official has also spoken about resumption of executions and amputations. And in the context of Afghanistan, where we have seen these things happen, not only when Taliban were ruling the country, but also in areas controlled by them in the past 20 years. This is extremely worrying. There seems to be no due process or access to free trial with a lot of these quote unquote punishments that are happening and the arrests that are happening. There are severe restrictions on freedom of expressions. You all heard in early September about journalists in Kabul being beaten up, tortured. Journalists are illegally detained. After this incident, after 2 journalists were beaten up and tortured in Kabul, Taliban promised investigations and accountability. There has been no announcements on what investigations have amounted to or who has been held accountable. And we see a lot more self-censorship. Afghan media, or in the whole region, one of the most free and independent media in the region. And we have just seen in the space of a little over a month that freedom being severely restricted. The restrictions on women's rights, of course, are the most widespread, severe, and universal. It has been more than a week since girls have been literally banned from secondary education, from high school and from universities, public universities. There are restrictions imposed on women's employment, female employees of many institutions, all institutions, but Ministry of Health at this point, and partly Ministry of Education have been told to stay home. Unclear when they would be able to resume their work, and if they would be able to resume their work in the same positions that they held before. For instance, it took a lot of hard work for women to get to middle management positions in ministries of finance and commerce and many of these sectors. Women who worked for these institutions are now uncertain about what's next for them. They don't have any clarity. And of course, there is a continuous attempt to completely erase women from the public space, women's photos, women's presence, women's participation, and in the public and political sphere. It's a very systemic attempt to confine women to their homes, and a lot of very vague promises that with no delivery. There are also very varying reports of enforced displacements with a very specific ethnic dimension. The latest is enforced displacement of ethnic Hazaras from several villages. It's in this environment of ongoing violations. There's also the fact that the laws and the delivery of justice has been suspended. Women victims of violence and abuse have to basically live with that violence and abuse because there is nowhere they can go to, and they fear punishment if they try to register complaints or go to courts. Prosecutors and judges are mostly in hiding. The Commission has not been able to monitor the situation due to concerns for the safety of our staff. Our offices have been taken over, and the Commission's independence has not been recognized by the Taliban to allow us to continue to operate and deliver services and work with female victims of domestic abuse, child victims of abuse, register complaints, follow-up complaints, monitor places of detention, and monitor and document human rights abuses. So a whole range of key human rights activities by a national human rights institution is currently suspended. While we have had updates from the High Commissioner to the Human Rights Council, we haven't seen any detailed reports or press statements on abuses and allegations of abuses by UNAMA since Taliban's takeover of Kabul. So while they may continue doing some documentation, we as members of the public are really not aware of to what extent that documentation is happening and what deterrent impact could it have. So it's in this environment that we have repeatedly, even before Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, we had asked for a fact-finding mission, for a well-resourced investigative and monitoring mechanism to document the human rights abuses and violations in Afghanistan and violations of international humanitarian law. Since we made that call in May, the situation for human rights in Afghanistan has gotten far worse. The ability of national institutions and independent media severely limited. And so if anything, we need a stronger mechanism. I am encouraged that there has been a serious discussion among member states about a mechanism in this Human Rights Council session about a mechanism for Afghanistan. However, I just want to reiterate that doing just something is not good enough. It has to be a well-resourced mechanism. It has to be able to make carry out meaningful work, investigative work, and monitoring. It has to be it has to have the ability to communicate to Taliban that it is able to watch and document, and it should have, so that it can have some deterrent impact, but also can create some hope for accountability. This is a really hopeless moment for Afghanistan. And as a human rights defender and talking to human rights community in Afghanistan, many of our colleagues now in exile from the broader human rights movement in Afghanistan. But despite this hopelessness, we know this is not the end of the journey for human rights in Afghanistan. Right now, at this moment of transition and uncertainty and darkness, we just need the member states to step in and to support a well-resourced mechanism and document what's going on. And we are working to regroup. We are working to do what we can, but we can't do it on our own. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that very sobering and disquieting update, Shahrzad. And as you said, the situation has gotten worse. And in this regard, the messages from the High Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as a group of special rapporteurs about the need for a more robust mechanism is important. And also, of course, the situation in terms of economic and social rights and humanitarian assistance, which is quite dire. I'm going to ask now Mr. Kenneth Roth of Human Rights Watch to take the floor, if I may. Ken, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Sam, and thanks to everyone who's joined this very important event today. As you all recall, at last month's Human Rights Council special session, which of course took place just after the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, the consensus resolution stressed the need for transparent and prompt investigations. Now is the time to put in place an investigative mechanism to give effect to that call. And the question, of course, before us is, what form will that mechanism take? Now, some say it's too early to establish a fully resourced fact-finding mechanism of the sort that Shahrzad was just rightfully pleading for. They say, oh, the Taliban leadership is making some moderate noises. We should wait and see. An ordinary special rapporteur, perhaps supplemented by a little help from OHCHR, that should suffice. In fact, what we're already seeing are signs that, despite efforts to pretty up the ugly reality, Taliban 2.0 has many of the same deeply disturbing practices as Taliban 1.0. Now, just as a preliminary matter, I should say that Human Rights Watch has a long history of monitoring Taliban conduct going back decades. We've been closely scrutinizing their conduct, not only since the takeover, but also during the period when they gradually assumed control of the country. And what we have found is deeply disturbing, more than enough to warrant a fully resourced fact-finding mechanism. Let me begin with an enormous area of concern, which is the treatment of women. Since taking power, the Taliban have denied girls access to all secondary education, and they have severely restricted women's access to higher education. They have denied many women access to employment. They have drastically restricted women's freedom of movement. They've imposed restrictions on women's dress. And these attacks, come on top of the horrible attacks on girls' education, especially among the Hazara minority that preceded the Taliban's rise to power, many at the hands of the Islamic State. Now, the Taliban have also dismantled the fragile systems developed over the last 20 years to protect and to provide some modicum of justice for survivors of gender-based violence, with shelters now closing and judges, prosecutors, and lawyers in hiding. Now, since the Taliban have taken control, Human Rights Watch has also documented ongoing summary executions, forced disappearances, and arbitrary detentions, many of people associated with the former government as officials or security personnel. Now, relatives of these officials have also been targeted. And these reprisals have happened in multiple provinces, including Helmand, Kandahar, and Nangarhar. A particular long-standing concern is the targeted killings of high-profile activists, including many women. Women who have fought for rights or taken on roles that are seen by extremists as off limits for women, such as politicians, journalists, senior government officials, lawyers, judges, police officers, or even soldiers, they've been assassinated by both the Taliban and ISIS. They've also faced threats by people trying to force them out of their jobs. Now, aside from women's rights, one of the great accomplishments of the last 20 years in Afghanistan has been the emergence of an independent and vibrant media. That now is also under severe attack. The Taliban have arrested and beaten journalists for covering protests. New directives for journalists include rules against publishing on topics in conflict with Islam or insulting to national personalities. Many in the media now carefully self-censor. Many Afghan journalists have fled the country. Dozens more are in hiding. And more than 100 local media companies and radio stations have stopped operating altogether. Prominent newspapers now publish only online. Now, the loss of an independent media is a tragedy in its own right, but it also severely limits our access to information about Taliban atrocities, which frankly underscores the urgency of the Human Rights Council creating a strong fact-finding mechanism. Now, we're also concerned about reports of the Taliban arresting people for supposedly criminal activities that may include criticizing Taliban officials or other kinds of dissent. Civil society activists have been detained because of social media content and compelled to promise not to criticize the Taliban. Afghan journalists who have not been evacuated have continued to face death threats. The Taliban, as you've heard, have also vowed to resume executions for crimes like murder and adultery. And just the very next day in Herat, 4 bodies, as was mentioned, of alleged kidnappers were displayed publicly as a warning. The Taliban also vowed to resume amputation of hands for theft, claiming that it was necessary for security, even though every other country in the world manages somehow without amputations. Now, needless to say, there has been no accountability for these Taliban attacks on basic rights. No investigations, no prosecutions. There is an urgent need for the Human Rights Council to step in now to show that these are serious crimes that the world takes seriously. That's the best way to deter their continuation. Now, we're aware of the arguments against a strong fact-finding mechanism, but frankly, none of them holds water. Some say we should wait and see. They note the milder rhetoric coming from some senior Taliban officials and want to see whether that nice talk will be translated into action. But without much waiting, we've already seen a lot of disturbing things. All the important government positions have now been taken by hardliners, marginalizing even the negotiators from Doha. In turn, the early Taliban practices bear disturbing resemblance to the last period of Taliban rule. Wait and see is an invitation to a resumption of past brutality. A strong Human Rights Council response now is the best way to deter such brutality. Now, some governments fear that a tough stand by the Human Rights Council might impede evacuations of endangered Afghans that are still needed. In fact, the opposite is true. A weak response in Geneva will bolster the hardline members of the Taliban who are the greatest threat to ongoing evacuations. Moreover, we shouldn't let the Taliban blackmail us by treating the right to leave one's country as contingent on international silence before Taliban atrocities. And the Taliban's need for international assistance, another moderating factor, will remain even after strong Human Rights Council action. Now, some are not eager to examine Afghanistan too closely for fear that past practices of the Western-backed governments, of the Western-backed former Afghan government may may also be excavated in the process. But the past, frankly, is no excuse for the atrocities today, and we shouldn't allow worries about the past to stop a vigorous response today. Now, a mere special rapporteur with some assistance from OHCHR is not enough. Given the complexity of the country, an investigative mechanism needs a full team, dedicated resources, and a clear mandate to examine all of the relevant facts and circumstances, to advance accountability for perpetrators and justice for victims, and to operationalize immediately. Finally, the quest for a consensus resolution cannot justify a weak resolution. Consensus generally is overrated at the Human Rights Council, particularly since it tends to mean lowering ambition levels for the sake of an outcome that often fails to rise to the needs of the moment. We already heard at the first informal a range of states, including from Latin America and Africa, expressing support for a stronger approach. There are many examples of contested resolutions yielding strong and effective investigative mechanisms. That is the least that the dire situation today in Afghanistan deserves. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Ken, for that analysis, and also for the historical reminder of the Taliban and their record in Afghanistan going back for quite some time at Human Rights Watch. Let me ask Professor Camilla Nalin, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism, to take the floor now. Obviously, one of the major issues in Afghanistan over the years has been the housing of terrorism and terrorist organizations there. Certainly rhetorically, this is something that many governments around the world and in this council have really focused on. So if I may turn the floor over to Professor Nalin, you have the floor, please.
Morning. Thank you, Sam, or good afternoon in Geneva. So here we are, and in a fundamental sense, we shouldn't be here. The scale and the nature of what has happened in Afghanistan demanded clear, unequivocal, unambiguous action to preserve and protect human rights. And yet here we are again. We find ourselves on the margins of yet another Human Rights Council session, pressing for minimums in a context where maximums should be on the table. So what do we know since the signing of that agreement between the United States and the, quote, Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which is not recognized by the United States as a state and known as the Taliban? And there's a mouthful that tells you a lot about what's on the table. Recognized by the Security Council in Resolution 2513 in 2020. Well, we know a lot, and we know it from those who have been on the ground, including Shahrazad. As she and others have told us in the preceding months through August, through July, and before that, Afghanistan's daily staple was marked by a record targeting of civilians and civilian casualties, including record deaths among women and children. I joined with other special rapporteurs a statement presented to the Human Rights Council at its special session, noting, quote, the gravity of civilian harms that have been caused by that latest military offensive and the well-founded fear of the Afghan people rooted in an onslaught of fighting during this offensive, as well as over the course of the last 18 months. All of which requires accountability. As we understand, and we think we need to understand, the broader threat posed by the Taliban, it's worth going back to June 2021, when the UN monitoring team, which reports to the Sanctions Committee and the Security Council, was clear-eyed and unambiguous in its statements to the Security Council. It said, Al-Qaeda is present in at least 15 Afghan provinces, and according to member states, Al-Qaeda maintains contact with the Taliban, but has maintained a position of laying low so as not to jeopardize the Taliban's diplomatic position. The team the team that reports on security to the Security Council, also reported that it's impossible to ascertain with confidence that the Taliban will live up to its commitments to suppress any future international threat coming from al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda and like-minded militants continue to celebrate the developments in Afghanistan as not simply a victory for the Taliban's cause, but for global radicalism. So we know that, and we also know what women have told us and have been telling us for months, that their own lives and the lives of their girls are being irreparably damaged by the emergence of this power. We also know it factually, as Ken has told us. On September 8th, 2021, the Taliban declared an Islamic emirate and appointed a transitional government composed of 10 men, at least 8 of whom are designated individuals under the 1988 sanctions regime, and made absolutely no move towards an inclusive or negotiated intra-Afghan dialogue or settlement. We also know that the Ministry of Women's Affairs have been dissolved. So what does this knowledge demand of us? What does it demand of states? It demands a robust, resourced, fact-finding body as a minimum. This is what is required. And why not a special rapporteur? Well, not to decry my own métier and not to undermine the extraordinary work that many of my colleagues do. This is not fit for purpose. The role we have is not fit for this purpose, for this need. It is an insider's secret known to all that we have full-time jobs, that we are so meagerly resourced that we function as beggars on our universities, NGOs, and parasites on some meager external funding, so we can simply try to keep up with the work that we are mandated to do. And this is the response to the compelling, overwhelming need that is manifest in Afghanistan. When you appoint, if states are to appoint an SR to this moment, to this evidence need, what you are saying is, we're not serious about this need. We are not listening to you. You want to placate us because we're making a little bit of noise and that makes you uncomfortable. So you feel like you have to do something, but you're telling us as clearly as you can that the kind of monitoring, oversight, preservation of evidence, benchmarking of systematic patterns and forms of human rights violations are not your concern because you're not going to put the resources in place to evidence them. So this tells us that the kinds of pressure and the kinds of demands that we have will simply not be met by the establishment of a special rapporteur, no matter how well qualified, no matter how desirous to do good. Let me just say beyond that a couple of other things which are clearly on the table and integrate with and are relevant to fact-finding body, and that is sanctions. The United Nations and member states find themselves in what we might call somewhat of a pickle, because we are looking at the renewal of the 1988 sanctions regime scheduled for December 21. And with the Taliban's control over the country and the named individuals sitting in government, we have an obvious problem. And let me suggest what we need to do from a human rights perspective really briefly. The first is that sanctions system is deeply dysfunctional and not human rights compliant and is in need of massive overhaul to preserve the individual rights of those who are placed upon it. We know that, not least because the ombudsman for the sanctions system resigned this summer after years of telling us that the system was rule of law deficient. The second thing we know about those sanctions regime is that they have the capacity to operate upon those who have committed serious violations of international law, and they should be used in that way. The third is that we need sustained engagement of that sanctions monitoring oversight with civil society, including Afghan civil society, so that they are directly informed by those who experience the harms on the ground. And finally, we need the UN itself to understand that unless we address the sanctions issue, we will continue to plow towards a massive humanitarian disaster in Afghanistan that will not be remedied as we hang-wring both on reforming sanctions so that there are humanitarian exemptions, and as we need to set up a human rights monitoring mechanism, which is one of the things that will support an effective sanctions oversight system. These things are all connected. And so I close by reminding us that when the Security Council spoke in June 2020, it said, any political settlement must protect the rights of all Afghans, including women, youth, and minorities, and respect the strong desire of Afghans to achieve durable peace and prosperity. Even in this moment, we have no right to abrogate the rights of Afghans to those fundamental human rights, and a fact-finding mission is the least of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Finola. And obviously your cautions regarding the situation with sanctions and the UN terrorism and counterterrorism mechanism for a number of states are crucial. What is clearly needed is credible information from the ground for states to be able to make those decisions. And also just to say that you have done an outstanding job, you and other special rapporteurs. So we take the fact that you've been able to do this with minimal resources as a sign of your abilities, but also your warnings about the inability of the inherent inability of the post to face the complex situation in Afghanistan is a very serious warning. Let me ask to join us then Agnes Callamard, the Secretary General of Amnesty International, also the former Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression. She can speak to both the factual situation on the ground and the response to it. So, Ms. Callamard, if I may, over to you.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, everyone, for your compelling presentation. I think most has been said. I will just maybe repeat a few points. The first is that what we are looking at right now, as all previous speakers have highlighted, is not a wait and see scenario. The human rights situation on the ground is already grave, complex, and fast evolving. The time to act is now. Of course, there will be a time to act in the future, but to expect that the situation right now does not require a strong, or indeed the strongest possible answer, I think is extremely misplaced and sending the very wrong message. I am not going to repeat the litany of violations that have been highlighted already by my predecessors in that event, just to point out that in the space of a few weeks, just in the space of a few weeks, we are already witnessing a large number of violations which indicate an ideological framework and basis that has not shifted from what it used to be more than 20 years ago. And therefore, we know how bad and how very bad it will get, and it is already pretty awful. Second, therefore, it is essential that the right and strong message be sent now. It is clear that international human rights monitoring now is already critical, given the prevailing climate of fear, given the lack of mobile connectivity, the internet blackout, given the fact that networks of contact have gone silent out of fear or because they have left or seeking to leave the country. Human rights monitoring is extraordinarily important right now. It is crucial that we be back on the ground so that we can reestablish those networks and can collect the information that is so needed for the international community to make critical decisions, including on those that have been raised by Fionnuala Ní Amháin in relation to sanction. In addition to that documentation, the preservation of that information, the preservation of evidence is also critical to send a clear message to the Taliban that international crimes do not go unnoticed or unpunished, to ensure that the international community is informed as best as it can when it makes important decisions in the coming weeks regarding its relationship to the Taliban and the nature of that relationship to the Taliban, to support those that have been on the front line of fighting for human rights for the last 20 years and are still very much so on the front line right now, but on their own. And they continue to do their work at significant personal risk. For those reasons, current documentation and preservation is absolutely crucial. And this is why Amnesty International, together with the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, together with ICJ, Human Rights Watch, and 60 other organizations from around the world, have been urging the Human Rights Council to establish a robust investigative mechanisms. It is essential that that mechanism be in pair with the challenges that we are confronting. And I'm not going to repeat what Fionnuala has just said about what Special Rapporteur can achieve. I was one myself on extrajudicial executions less than a year ago, and we can do some great stuff. But the situation in Afghanistan is absolutely not meant for the work of a special rapporteur. It just doesn't, it's not fit. What we can do, what they can do, is not fit for the current situations. I was in Geneva last week. I have repeated that message to almost everyone I have met. You need to have a mechanism that is fit for the environment. And that mechanisms must be well resourced. It must be on the ground. It must have ears on the ground. It must have feet on the ground. It must be large enough that it can cover a fairly large countries with huge challenges. It must also be politically commensurate with the nature of the challenge. It must send a message to the Taliban and to others that this is not business as usual, that the international community is absolutely prepared to take stock of the current situation and to send the right message to a government that is also not currently recognized. I would like to reiterate the fact that there is a momentum right now, in my view, that the international community can be more ambitious than it seems to be prepared to be, that it can trade on and use the little power that it has at its disposal to push for a mechanism that will be able to deliver what is needed given the context. It doesn't have to be called an FFM, fact-finding mission. It doesn't matter what it's called, the precise name, the precise formulation, provided it can get the job done. And in order to get the job done, like I said, it needs to have resources, it needs to have people on the ground, it needs to have a political recognition, it needs to be able to report authoritatively to the Human Rights Council, to the Security Council, and to a range of other decision making. It must have an investigative mandate, it must have an investigative capacity, including on a range of international legal issues from human rights to humanitarian to criminal law. It must be properly empowered to contribute to accountability. That is what is needed. That is what is needed to deliver the message that the Taliban needs to hear, and it's what is needed for the people of Afghanistan, for the human rights of defenders of Afghanistan, for the activists of Afghanistan that are still inside the country and will be prepared to provide information even where their life is at risk. But to do so, we need to have in place a mechanism that will be able to act on the risk that they themselves will take. We cannot let them down. We cannot let them down one more time. Please act courageously. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Agnes, for that call for courage, and again, a reminder of how long people of Afghanistan have faced incredibly difficult circumstances, and they have continued to fight. And the least we can do is to provide them with some assistance in this regard. We have a few minutes, so if there are questions and answers, questions that people want to raise, or if people want to try to speak from the floor, please identify yourself on the chat. I want to go next. I see that there's a request to speak appropriately from Dr. Nasser Andisha, the ambassador of Afghanistan to Geneva. Your Excellency, the floor is yours, if I may ask for a brief intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sam, and thanks to all colleagues and the organizer of today's very important side event. I can't do anything but to agree with the speakers before me. And I think so the issues in front of us, both here in Geneva, but also seriously in Afghanistan, were put forward by the experts and by all the speakers before me, and I'm not going to repeat those aspects. I just wanted to be very brief and to mention, that when we start calling for a special session, even before this, as Mr. Shahzad Akbar mentioned, we were looking into a fact-finding mission well in April and May. But then we called the special session, and the request for the special session particularly was to enact that fact-finding mission immediately before even the council, this session, before this session started. But we all know what happened, and our efforts just to get the special session was a marathon. And I thank really everyone here in this panel, but also the member states who really helped us to put together something. I understand that many of us have been very disappointed, but given the situation, I think the resolution that we came with at that moment was a base on which we can now build and further build, and to create what we all desire is a very strong fact-finding mission in Afghanistan. There are many reasons which have been mentioned there, but politically, because I'm looking into it from a member state perspective here, and also we are negotiating with a number of countries, including with the OIC, where we had a briefing just last week. And I mentioned and I emphasized that the early optimism which existed, not everywhere, very cautious optimism, but among a number of states and actors, have faded in the past month and a half. I think where there is no more perhaps excuses for wait and see, as it was categorically mentioned in our today's interventions. Because so far, what we have seen from Taliban in the month and a half, but also since the agreement that they signed with the United States, is that they have not fulfilled any of the promises they made within that agreement, but also the resolution which endorsed that agreement. And if I can remind our colleagues here and everyone who is listening, reduction of violence, delinking from the terrorist organization, from Al-Qaeda and the others, and then not taken over by force, not attacking major centers, not monopolizing power, not returning their draconian emirate, and respects for human rights and for women's rights. So these are, I think, the basic elements which we all heard time and again from the Doha offices. And what we see today on the ground is certainly contrary to all of this. So, and even in the past 1 month and a half, we have seen is, as colleagues mentioned, Taliban 2.0 is even more ruthless and careless about the international norms and orders than Taliban 1.0. So I think that this is time. I think it's time that we have to raise our voice on behalf of the 36 million Afghan people who have been, under the barrels of the guns, and they have somehow been taken hostage. So what we do, what's our efforts? We engage with the OIC, we engage with like-minded countries, we engage with every possible actor here to tell them that what the reality is on the ground, what is happening, and why and a strong monitoring and documentation and fact-finding mechanism will be important. As other speakers mentioned, it's actually will help not only the Afghan people, but also maybe even some moderate, in the heart of their heart, some moderate Taliban are looking forward to some sort of mechanism because they have been sort of, disempowered by what's happening on the ground. So my efforts at the end and efforts of my mission here, I know we are in a very difficult situation here, but what we do is we really concentrate on the issues of human rights. We really concentrate on giving voice to the millions of voiceless Afghans, especially men and women. So if you look at my diplomats, young men and young women diplomats here, they press their points. They wanted to be the voice of those Afghans who doesn't have voice in Kabul and different cities, and to raise their voice, especially in the Human Rights Council, but also engage everyone in the diplomatic level. So I wanted to say that this now is the moment for the international community to act, and an act which commensurate with the gravity of the crisis. The Human Rights Council was created to address this very situation, and for the Council to maintain its credibility, it must step into its role and to meet impunity with action. The Council has the tool to establish a robust, independent mechanism to prevent and ensure accountability for serious human rights abuses, which continues to happen in Afghanistan, including the past. We are not hiding from the past acts. We urge the Council member, in line with the Council's mandate, to adopt a resolution in its current session, establish a dedicated mechanism, and answer the demands of millions of Afghans for a call for High Commissioner, Special Rapporteurs, and Afghanistan's Independent Human Rights Commission and the civil society. We have heard their calls loud and clear. So finally, the theme of today's side event is the international response to the human rights crisis in Afghanistan. So we ask our panelists, our audience, and everyone else that who shares our view on how international community can best support the preservation of democracy, human rights, and essential elements of sustainable peace in Afghanistan. And in this, I thank you very much.
Dr. Andisha, thank you very much for a very frank and clear request for giving voice to your compatriots, and also for the impact I think this kind of human rights monitoring would have on the political situation. I just want to, we have a few minutes left. I want to ask a quick question. One of the issues that has been raised about human rights monitoring has been the notion that maybe it's not possible, that we don't know, that people don't know what access to the country is going to be like. I actually just wanted to ask quickly, Shahrzad Akbar maybe, and Anis Kalamart, who as a special rapporteur on extrajudicial killings actually carried out a major criminal investigation, essentially from afar, just to speak very briefly about the possibilities for people to be able to cover the situation in Afghanistan on the ground, but if need be, from afar. What is the capacity in the NGO community? What is the capacity for the international community to do this kind of work?
Thank you, Sam. I can just talk about our experience in the Commission. I mean, we continue documenting atrocities and violations of international humanitarian law in parts of Afghanistan where we did not have an office. And we continued to do it in the thick of the conflict, you know, when bombs were going on and fighting was going on. We could do this because I believe in this. There is a belt of human rights defenders, there's a belt of human rights activists, but also ordinary people who have now greater awareness about what human rights violations were. And people would come to us, people would want to report to us. We would keep receiving audios, videos, other material. We keep receiving now as well, but since we are not in operation, since our offices are not fully in operation, we don't have a dedicated team who can sit down and go through that material and look at that and match, you know, data and look at different sources. But people are continuing to record, people are continuing to document to the extent that they can, and people want to share. People continue sharing with the Commission staff still till today what's happening on the ground, because people know that these are violations, they shouldn't happen, and they should be documented. Afghanistan is a country that has lived with human rights atrocities for more than 40 years, and people now know an atrocity when it's happening and want to report on it. I mean, a lot of what we also know about Afghanistan right now is coming from citizen activists, basically. So it is possible. I don't think that can be an excuse that documentation is not possible. The Commission was an A-status institution. When in operation is an A-status institution that operates in an extreme environment of conflict, and we managed to document really, really complex cases. We were able to continue to document because of these local sources and local communities' willingness and desire and thirst for justice, thirst for accountability that compelled them to share information with us.
Thank you, Shahrzad. And yes, can you talk a little bit about the ability, the capacity of the international community to continue documenting these events if there is an institution in place?
Well, if you know, ideally, we do need to have a recognized entity on the ground. I mean, UNAMA is one step. To me, it's not sufficient in terms of the political message, because UNAMA was already there in the previous years. And I am absolutely clear that we need to send a very clear message to the Taliban that this is not as bad as it used to be before. It's still not business as usual, and that we need to step up our effort. So UNAMA is certainly an important element in the information gathering, but it will not be sufficient. There is no doubt that we can report without being able to be on the ground. Of course, we've done that. The OHCHR has done it. It is hopefully going to do it with its report on China, and it has done so on previous reports in the past. You know, both Human Rights Watch and Amnesty have documented situations where we could not go on, you know, in the site of the violation itself. So it is absolutely feasible. The ICC, just to name them, is about to initiate an investigation into the Philippines, and it has not been allowed there, just to give you one example. And indeed in Afghanistan as well. So we can do it, but I think the message that we want to send today, all of us here, is that a presence on the ground, feet on the ground, ears on the ground, will play multiple functions, one of which will be to information gathering, one of which will be to send a very clear political message that we are prepared for the worst. We want to be on the ground. We are not looking at the situation as it was 3 months ago. This is, you know, a tremendously different environment. We want to be there for that reason. This is a political message that the equivalent of a fact-finding mission will send to the Taliban and to other government. And then for their sake of decision making in an extraordinarily complex environment, I will think that the international community will want to have the best possible intelligence, including human rights intelligence. So for all those reasons, yes, we can collect information from afar, but no, let's try to do it on the ground, be there with the people, and send the right message with the right level of evidence that we need.
Thank you for that, Agnes. There's also a question on the question and answer about what can in addition to the action by the Human Rights Council, what can we expect from other national institutions? And I would add to that other international institutions who are looking at this issue. So if I can ask Ken and Fionnuala, both of whom have dealt very much with these issues in different forums, to address that, please. Ken, if you would go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Sam. I mean, first, the question about international institutions, I think, brings up the International Criminal Court, which just today announced that it would focus its investigation on Taliban and ISIS abuses. Now, I think that's a controversial statement, because we know that Afghan government forces, the prior government, as well as its backers, committed serious abuses. Indeed, the last few years have seen record numbers of civilian casualties. So, I understand that the ICC was under pressure, particularly from the United States, not to look at the question of torture. I fear that this is a capitulation, and that it makes the ICC look partisan. Rather than say we're going to look at the most severe abuses, regardless of who committed them, it's saying, oh, we're just going to be forward-looking. And I think that was a mistake, which I hope will be fixed. I should note, though, that the ICC is, first of all, not a substitute for the Human Rights Council. It's much more slow-moving. It's obviously a criminal prosecutor. It takes a long, long time for just a handful of cases to emerge. Whereas we need a well-resourced fact-finding mechanism now to regularly report on what's going on. If we're going to wait 5 years for the first prosecution, which is typically happens with the ICC, you're giving 5 years of impunity, 5 years of a lack of pressure on the Taliban to respect rights now. So we need that current investigation and reporting. I do want to reiterate that while remote monitoring is very possible, as Agnes and Shahrazad have said, it's time consuming, because you need to verify things. You can't just sort of take what people send to you. And it requires not only sort of lots of cross-checking remotely, by WhatsApping people or what have you, but you need to use, analysis of open source video. You need to use satellite imagery if it's available. This is very time-consuming work that requires a dedicated staff. And so to pretend that, a special rapporteur, which, as has been noted, is, typically a law professor or some kind of professor trying to, beg for resources, even when supplemented by the overburdened, overtasked OHCHR staff, it's just not going to do the trick. We need the dedicated resources. Now, in terms of national governments, they certainly can investigate as best they can, but I think that this is also a perfect example where the use of universal jurisdiction is very appropriate. We've seen this done quite effectively now in Syria, where Germany, France, Sweden have been pursuing cases of senior Syrian officials who have been responsible for serious crimes. But let's recognize what the prelude to that was. It was the so-called IIIM, that is to say, a dedicated, well-resourced investigative mechanism that collected that information and then shares it with national resources. So let's not pretend that national governments can somehow prosecute if the UN is not going to invest in a comparable mechanism, or at least something that is well resourced and can bring in the evidence and preserve it that's required. That's not a special rapporteur.
Sam, I'll just briefly comment. I think that I just make a couple of, for national parliamentarians, I would say use your national legal systems, use your parliamentary committees, hold hearings. We've seen that very successfully done by a number of parliaments on key issues involving, for example, human rights abuses related to Xinjiang. It's been a way of actually investing energy and attention from the national level that signals to government that their own parliamentarians are taking these issues seriously. And there's a crying need for that kind of investment by national parliaments in these issues, both as a human rights matter, but also as a matter of security and the long-term strategic interests of many states. I think that's clear. The second thing I would just say is I think we also need to protect the UNAMA mandate. Anyone who's taken a close look at the language of the UNAMA mandate knows that that mandate is actually pretty good in terms of some of the core issues. And I think one of my fears would be that in the months ahead, just as we've seen a downgrading of interest in the Human Rights Council, that we have to continue to bolster the Security Council's desire to remain apprised of keeping UNAMA as a strong and relevant force, and not to see the stripping out of the human rights language, human rights and humanitarian language that is central to the UNAMA resolution. And the third, of course, is obviously sanctions, that there is an opportunity. I think there's a golden opportunity. Afghanistan may, in fact, present us with an opportunity to revise sanctions regime, including consistently having a humanitarian exemption, including in these resolutions, which has not been the case for counterterrorism sanctions resolutions for over 2 decades. So let's seize that opportunity, make sure that it happens for Afghanistan, but actually ensure that it's happening for many other places too, South Sudan, Yemen, and others who are dire need of those kinds of exemptions. And finally, I would just simply say, I think we have to continue to press where we can. I endorse Ken's comments around the need for holistic accountability in Afghanistan. I would recall that this week, the Working Group on Disappearances issued a report on cross-border transfers, the legacy of 9/11 and the responsibilities that go with the ongoing entrenchment of extraordinary rendition in state practice since that time. My mandate will issue a follow-up report to the 2010 torture and rendition report to the Human Rights Council in the spring. And I am very clear which states are clearly in my sight around a lack of accountability, an endorsement of impunity, and the need to have accountability. Time is, we do not forget these violations, and we certainly don't forget the permissible environment that they have created globally. And I think this is why the opportunity in Afghanistan is so important. This work needs to be preserved for now, but for later too. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Ken and Camilla. We've gone slightly over our time, but I'm glad to see that there's a high level of interest still. But to wrap up and to remind colleagues of where we are, the call has been from voices from Afghanistan and the international community for what is essentially a very modest response by this council, a response that it has provided in several other human rights crises, a response to gather information, to be able credibly and properly to monitor the situation in Afghanistan and to report on it in order to allow the council and its states to respond appropriately. This is something that is, I think, as one of our speakers said, a minimum response to a maximal situation. And this is, I think, something that we have to keep in mind. As we've heard, we've already seen, despite promises by the Taliban, significant incidents of gender and ethnic discrimination, an absolute breakdown in Afghanistan's already feeble judicial process, a return to brutal and public punishments, but an end to Afghanistan's vibrant media. We once again have to rely on brave international media to help their Afghan colleagues give voice to what's happening. A breakdown in Afghan civil society almost entirely, but not just civil and political rights violations. As we know, there are at least 18 million people, 50% of Afghanistan's population requires humanitarian assistance, which it's receiving from the United Nations and international civil society. About a third of Afghanistan's population faces the genuine threat of hunger and malnourishment, and this figure is certainly going to rise due to the collapse of Afghanistan's finances because of the inability of the Taliban to access their funds. We have seen a massive increase in internal displacement and potentially, therefore, a refugee crisis. We have seen the High Commissioner for Human Rights and other experts, special rapporteurs, people with a great deal of experience, some of whom we've just heard from today, calling for an international mechanism, in part because although the UNAMA mandate is very important, UNAMA was and will remain to some extent hostage to humanitarian issues. The absolute need to provide credible, independent information that will not in any way jeopardize the humanitarian work of our colleagues is crucial. And that's why everyone has called for an independent mechanism. And finally, a reminder that this need not just be a punitive message to the Taliban. If indeed they want to show that they are Taliban 2.0, that they are going to behave more responsibly, that they are better than what their track record has been for the past 25 years, we need an independent, credible mechanism that can report on these advances. It is absolutely in the hands of the Taliban to show that politically they will create a more inclusive government, that in terms of human rights behavior, that they will behave better, and that they will honor the obligations that Afghanistan has as a member state. We cannot condemn the people of Afghanistan to live in a human rights-free zone in Afghanistan. After decades, the Afghan people have struggled with international assistance where possible to achieve quite a lot. And we cannot throw all of that away. So with all of that in mind, I want to bring this session to a close. I want to thank our colleagues from the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch for joining the ICJ in organizing this event. I absolutely appreciate the message from Ambassador Andisha, who is, after all, representing the important voice that is needed in this session. And I look forward to a robust discussion at the Human Rights Council 48th session. And I look forward to having a proper response by the Council that is commensurate with the gravity of the human rights crisis in Afghanistan and to the needs of the people of Afghanistan. With that, thank you very much. Goodbye.